So, LaVar, you said that you believe that the Chicago Bears are going to stay at 1 and they're going to not draft a quarterback, obviously. Do you have a player in mind that you believe the Bears would draft?
Yeah, it's going to be Carter.
All right. So that pays out 50-1. So you can get paid 50-1 if Jalen Carter is the pick at number 1 for the Chicago Bears.
Do you think that's their ideal plan?
I do. I think they have to take the best player available at number 1.
No, I guess what I'm asking is, if you look at their roster, because they are devoid of having a bunch of playmakers, wouldn't you think that they would say, if we could trade back, still get Jalen Carter, that would be the optimal idea of how we'd manage the number 1 overall pick?
I would say yes, but I think sometimes you just go ahead and get the player that you want to get, because things can kind of derail and maybe go a different direction. I mean, yeah, it's a given that who they would trade for would probably go for a quarterback 100%. But even with that being said, you trade back, and if your guy isn't there, that's one thing. There's also the conversation. Like I can recall when I was getting drafted, they were going to take me 3rd instead of 2nd just for negotiation purposes. Like, there's no reason to do that now because everything is slotted. But I think for Chicago to have the number 1 draft pick, they haven't had it in what is it, 70-some years?
I don't know if they've ever had it.
Or ever? Okay.
Yeah, I don't know.
Well, I just don't see them trading out of it. I think they'll take the best player available, and they don't need a quarterback, so they're going to probably take Carter at number 1.
All right, so 50-1 that pays out.
Well,
ready to get paid.
What I wonder is how they view the difference between Will Anderson Jr. and Jalen Carter. Because let's say you could trade back, you could get either one of those players. You know, do you sit there and take Will Anderson if Jalen Carter happens to go before that? And I think you'd be okay with that, but maybe they wouldn't. I don't know what their draft board looks like, but everyone. It was odd was everyone's making a big deal about his 40 because I think he ran a 4.60 40 for a DN.
Yeah,
I'm thinking to myself, when did that become a bad time for a defensive end, or when were people like, just because he's not Nolan Smith, which look, Nolan Smith ran a really fast 40 time, was fantastic. How much does he weigh? I mean, how big is he? Like, you kind of come away going, well, shouldn't he run that if he's going to be 235, 240 pounds versus what Will Anderson is out there? I think every single year we do this. We leave the combine. We come away with players that we look at that perform great. And I always have to remind myself, it's not football. Like, what they're doing out there is not football. It's a basis of comparison. But when you put on the tape, you know, you see things. Tank Dell, who's a small wide receiver, ran a 4.50 40. When you watch him on tape, he plays a lot faster than that. You know, and if you watch his 10-yard split, he probably didn't have his best start. But the reality is, like, if I'm a team taking him, looking to take him the 3rd, 4th round, I'm not deterred because he ran a 4.50. Like, I think I know what I'm getting in the player from what he did at the Senior Bowl and what he did on tape, you know, throughout the course of his career. It's always fun to talk about, but I just think we overreact to a lot of what happened over the past 5-6 days.
Is the difference between 1 and 2 at the position of Jalen Carter and so Will Anderson, the next best pass rusher, is the gap bigger between Will Anderson and the next best pass rusher, or the gap bigger between Jalen Carter and the next best interior lineman?
Why are we comparing Jalen and Will?
Top 2 defensive players.
Okay, that would be the comparison, because what Jalen Carter brings to the table is vastly different than what Will Anderson brings to the table. And the reason why I say that is because when you look at a guy like Chris Jones or Aaron Donald, that's what you're potentially getting in Jalen Carter. You're not getting that in Will Anderson. You're not. That's an edge rusher that you could potentially make him a 3-4 linebacker, or he'd be a defensive end. He's almost like a Brian Arakpo type of player, like a big, strong edge guy. He could play all 3 downs, but I don't see them moving him around inside, all the way down the line of scrimmage. Jalen Carter has the type of skill set, the explosiveness, the strength, and the ability to do what possibly what Chris Jones is doing right now. He has the ability and the skill set to possibly be as dominant on the inside as well. I mean, I'm saying Aaron Donald, but that there's that potential there. So when you have that type of a player and you bring him onto your team, if he develops into that type of player, it makes everything that much better. That's not what Will Anderson is as a player. So to me, if you're looking at Will Anderson, and you're saying this is a guy that I want on my team, I don't think you sit there and say, well, if we don't get Jalen Carter, we're good with Will Anderson. It's a vastly different. You're going in a different direction in terms of the type of player you're taking. So I mean I don't know if they're okay with that. I mean it's 1-2, it is what it is. But a Warren Sapp changes your team. An Aaron Donald changes your team. A Chris Jones, they change your team because they can play any different position from that inside spot.
Is he on that level, though?
He has the potential to be. He has that potential, 100%.
And he played a little bit that way at Georgia, right? I mean, in the majority of his snaps, he's playing mostly in the A-B gaps, more as a 3 technique. But he did play out over the tackle. He did play outside from time to time throughout the course of his career. So you definitely see the way Kirby Smart utilized him. To your point, LaVar, like they could put him in those spots. Whoever does decide to take him. Will Anderson, it wasn't quite the same. The bulk of his snaps were out over the tackle, either playing head up or outside. He very rarely ever moved much further down inside. Not saying he couldn't if he didn't, if he was asked to do so, but he'd have to put on weight. I mean, it's a different NFL.
Yeah. I mean, and maybe he can. And like I said, he's one of those guys, you could possibly move him back. You're not moving Jalen Carter back, right? But you could possibly move Will Anderson back and make him a stand-up linebacker. It just depends on the scheme of the team that he would go to. But one thing I know for certain, if you get a guy in the draft that has that unique ability and that talent, that's something you're born with. It being able to handle the trenches on the inside. What Aaron Donald is doing, yes, there's a lot of skill development for what Aaron Donald does. There's a lot of skill development connected to what Chris Jones has been able to do. But you're born with that. Make no mistake about that. Being able to go on the inside like that and be able to defeat double-team blocks, to be able to get back there the way that you're able to get back there, explode out of your hips. There's so many different things that go into having the type of body and athleticism and awareness to be able to put all of those things together in literally less than a second. It's something that's something you can't really teach the dog mentality that you have to be able to be in there and go to war the way that's those select few guys are able to do. They change your entire team. Guys like that change the entire complexity of your entire unit. So that's why it's far and away, whoever gets Jalen Carter, that's the potential. Now, will he turn into that guy? I don't know. But from what you see on film, what he brings to the table, he's certainly one of them guys where you sit there and you be like, God, I know when I was watching, I was like, God, like he's strong enough and he's quick enough to defeat you off of the ball anywhere on the ball. And most people will say the B gap is like the most important gap to be able to defend. If you can defend the B gap, you got a really, really good chance of having success against an offense, especially as it applies to the running game. But if you got a guy that can defeat you in the A gap at a 0 technique or at a 3 technique, and that guy that and further out can get in the backfield, not only get in the backfield, but finish the play. That's super important because you got some guys that are space eaters and they'll push it and they'll destroy the pocket like old school, like a Sam Adams or a Saragusa or a Tad Washington or, those type of guys. They'll push you in the back with all that strength and all that size, but they're not going to finish at the quarterback. right? They're going to give other guys the opportunity to finish at the quarterback, whether it's a defensive end, whether it's a blitzing linebacker, whether it's just them scraping to make the play. Jalen Carter is a difference maker by himself, and that to me, I just don't know. I don't even know that you play around with it. You just say, this is our guy, we're taking him, and that's what we're going to do.
I think you've got a number. You asked a question, Jonas, in regards to the drop off from Will Anderson to the next edge rusher, and the drop off from Jalen Carter to the next interior defensive tackle.
Yeah,
it's a bigger drop off from Jalen Carter to the next player, and that's not saying that, like, at least as far as production and what Will Anderson did at the college level and Jalen Carter did. Because some of it's projecting to a little bit. Like, people tend to forget, Will Anderson's season 2 years ago, he probably could have made the case he should have won the Heisman. Like, he was that phenomenal of a player. The difference, I think, in this class is you have, to me at least, a lot of depth at the edge rushing position. I mean, from Will Anderson to Myles Murphy to Tyree Wilson, who's got a ridiculous frame, wingspan, and upside, to Luke Van Ness, to Nolan Smith, who we talked about, who just ran the fastest 40 and all the things that he did, even to different players. The Will McDonald kid out of Iowa State, Andre Carter, who's an interesting prospect too out of Army. Isaiah Foskey, a kid who I thought had a great combine from Notre Dame and showcased his versatility. It's a very, very deep class to me for the edge rushers. So I look, you're not going to get the same player as Will Anderson if you don't take him that spot and you're looking at the edge. But you can get a guy who I think could come in and be a starter for you and an impact player for you in the second and third round of this class, unless there's just a huge run on edge rushers that we see in the first round in this year's draft.
I also think that if it's the Bears and they're trading back, part of the reason they trade back is they can pick up that second-round pick. Like, if they were to trade back with Houston to number 2, they're going to want to – obviously, they'll have the number 2 pick, but they're probably going to want to pick up a second-rounder from the Texans if possible, because they lost that second-rounder making the trade for Chase Claypool. So that happened in season. That's why I think the Bears are absolutely going to trade back. And ideally, it would probably be trade back, grab some extra picks, and then you take Jalen Carter. That would be the move.
It makes sense.
Yeah.
But I still think it's a splash theory to me. Like, we're Chicago. We need this. We're taking them at number 1.
I think that's – if they can't trade the pick and get the player they want to, I think that's the ideal scenario. I think it'd be plan B, or that's their second option if they have to stay put. I mean, you also wouldn't advertise it the way they've advertised it. If you felt that good about it, you probably stay more quiet about your plans, because the other thing about having the number 1 overall pick is, and especially if you're the Bears, right, because they haven't had success – it's a fan base that's a great fan base, and they're hoping to have a success and a winner. I think you kind of tickle them a little bit if you have the number 1 overall pick and you talk about trading it and you can't do it. It then almost looks like, Ryan Poles couldn't get a deal done, or he couldn't get the value that he wants, depending on where that team's trading up from. But that's the hard thing is, I think when you look at the values that have been set, we always talk about the draft value chart. Jimmy Johnson has one that everyone uses, but now everyone kind of has their own formula that they use to value these draft picks. Look at what San Francisco gave up to trade up to get Trey Lance. It wasn't the number 1 overall pick, but they moved, 8 spots, 7 spots?
Yeah. And
they gave up a boatload. And so you look at the premium that was placed on that move, and some teams look at it and say, hey, that's the price. And another team might say, well, that was for a quarterback. That's different. And in this case, you'd say if you're the Bears, if you're moving up to number 1, you're taking a quarterback. So the price is going to be really, really hefty, in my opinion. And I just wonder if there's anyone who's willing to give up that many picks to move up to the number 1 overall spot to assure that they get their guy as a quarterback. I think that's what's going to be interesting. And if they can't, how it's viewed by the Chicago fan base and people like yourself, Jonas, because I would think they'd view it as potentially a fail, even if they get a great player like Jalen Carter.
Yeah, don't stay at 1. If you're talking about all what you can do with the number 1 pick and Justin Fields is your guy, you got to come up with some picks, and you can't move far enough back. Like, I think Indianapolis moving back to 4, I think there's a good chance that Jalen Carter's gone, because Arizona would probably take Jalen Carter sitting at 3. So if the Bears move back to even 4, I think there's a chance that he's out.
They could use some edge help, though, in Arizona. Will Anderson's a good fit out there, too, if that potential spot was there. Or Tyree Wilson, depending on how they view him.